What's going on? Right. So hi everyone. I'm Mircea Zloteanu, and I'm going to be talking about some of the research that I've been conducting over the past few years, mostly based on my interest in the role of emotions in lie detection. So coming from initially a very classical type of perspective, but then the more I kind of delved into the problem, I found that none of the assumptions that people tended to have about this particular domain seem to actually match empirically. So I started to develop a new way of approaching the problem, which you'll see when I start to develop a bit more about what my title refers to. But broadly, I'm trying to reframe the concept of deception detection to focus more on judgment formation. So to contextualize things, my area of research focuses on human-to-human judgment. So basically either people face-to-face, people watching others on TV and making judgments, or in a more passive type of setting. So that's the type of research that I care about. I know that others have presented here over the past year all sorts of different domains like automated systems or group decision making, things like that. I focus more on how does somebody make judgments about the veracity of somebody else based on the information they have at hand. And the way I normally approach this is based on the concept of nonverbal cues. So the very traditional type of approach, but I put my own little spin on it, especially since my focus is on emotions, an area which for many people here, most of the more senior researchers on deception kind of find to be a dead area, saying like, no, we've tried to look into this. None of those areas seem to find any valuable insights. We can't improve accuracy. Therefore, we should just move on. So people are focusing on other elements. I think it's still a very rich area of research if we approach it with the proper perspective. So this is probably one of the most famous theoretical models that we have to try to encapsulate the type of nonverbal behavior that we could expect in deceptive versus truthful statements. So Zuckerman and colleagues have developed this three-factor model. Initially it was 4 factors, but they merged the emotions and arousal element. So essentially what they are discussing is this concept that when people are lying compared to when they're being honest, they will display different types of nonverbal behavior, and that others should be able to pick up on them to be able to make this type of veracity type of distinction. So it's normally split into emotional cues, cognitive load cues, and behavioral control cues. So I'll briefly mention what these are, and then I'll mention the ones that I focus on within my research. So cognitive load, one that I don't focus on, but I think it's still relevant to understand, simply states that when you're engaged in a lying activity, it diverts the resources that you would normally have to just behave normally, so gesticulate, illustrate, all of these things. And this reduction in resources will change your behaviors. For example, you might have a more restrictive type of body language. Maybe you won't articulate as much your speech, your sentences might be shorter, all of those things. 2 other methods in which people might display nonverbal behavior. One of them is called behavioral control. So this simply states that liars are intelligent enough to figure out that while they're lying, people might scrutinize their behavior. So they want to adapt it slightly, so they appear to be more honest, but this in itself might lead to slight differences. And lastly, the one that is the primary focus of my research, although both of them, the behavioral control and emotional one, are linked in my opinion, focus on the strong emotions that liars tend to experience, which might be useful in betraying their lie. So other people might focus on it. So I'll focus slightly on the 2 components that I care about the most. So behavioral control simply says that when we're looking for potential nonverbal cues, what we care about is that the controlled behavior that liars might be portraying should not look as genuine as when people are just being naturally honest. So it might look rehearsed, maybe out of sync, maybe slightly rigid. There might be something off about it. And for the longest time, these photos that I'm showing right now, the difference between what is called a Duchenne smile, so a genuine smile, and a non-Duchenne smile, also called a polite smile, has dominated both the fields of emotion and also of deception, articulating the fact that, well, when people are trying to deceive you about the emotions that they feel or the behavior they're experiencing, you should be able to pick up on it because the behavior is going to look faked. However, the research in emotions, especially the one that's been coming out in the last few years, does not show this. That's why I have this question mark and asterisk that this distinction that we've been using for a very long period of time, which is also the reason why it seems to kind of invalidate this concept of nonverbal cues, does not seem to track in terms of what people are actually displaying when they're being deceptive about their emotional experiences. Now, the second one that I focus on, and the one that most of you might be familiar with, is emotional leakage, and especially the leakage hypothesis that was popularized by Paul Ekman, which basically says that when you lie, you experience strong emotions that are unique to this concept of lying, such as fear and guilt. And because these tend to occur automatically, innately, and so on and so forth, you cannot fully suppress them, and elements of them will leak out through your nonverbal behavior. So the liars experience different emotions than truth tellers. The strength of these emotions might depend on circumstances. So if you've heard the term the stakes to the liar, that's what it refers to. In high stakes situations, these will be amplified compared to in low stakes. So maybe that means the detection will be easier. And that if you're astute to these types of nonverbal cues, you should be able to detect when people are lying versus when they are being honest. The strongest source of this portrayed type of cue are facial expressions. And I'll mention in a second why I think this is an important element, because again, this has been one of the dominating factors within this area of research, that you have these universal involuntary responses to deceptive situations, meaning that you should be able to use them to your advantage to determine if somebody's lying or telling the truth. However, my question going into this is this really how people use emotional information? So what I've been presenting so far can be labeled as kind of the astute decoder view, which basically says that if I am better at recognizing these types of nonverbal behavior, especially emotions, I should be better able to detect when somebody's lying or telling the truth. So this has been kind of the approach. However, the last few decades of research have not found strong, or even any, in my opinion, empirical support for this type of emotion-based notion. And I also recommend people read Timothy Luke's critique of some of the nonverbal behavior approaches that we've had. So what I'm trying to portray with my research is that we should kind of avoid the sunken cost fallacy of we've invested so much work into this decoder perspective that we're missing out on a potentially very interesting area of research. And to illustrate this, within the emotion field, so the second area of my most of my research, we've started to have a theoretical shift in how we see emotional cues and emotion in general. So the predominant view that we've had so far, and the one that I've been describing, has been referred to as the basic emotion theory, which states that emotional cues are these universal, innate, cross-culturally understood elements that people should be able to pick up on, mostly decoding them. So their function wasn't to communicate information, we just figured out that they have uses. But it also articulates that there should be differences between these so-called real and fake emotional cues. Now, the more modern behavioral ecology view states that the role of emotional cues is communicative principally. They could have evolved, but they could have also co-evolved to communicate information. They also permit variability between groups and different individuals, but also, and importantly, they don't assume this rigid distinction between genuine and fake expressions, because if their role is to communicate, you as the sender should be able to use them strategically to communicate the information that you want. So this has been fundamentally my approach to the research. I wanted to test the exact relationship between emotions and deception, contrasting what people have thought with these more modern type of approaches. So to kind of encapsulate it, the old traditional view basically says that emotional cues are useful to detecting deceptive versus honest behavior. If you as an individual, so a human, can recognize emotional cues better, you should be better able to detect deception. My view is that while emotional recognition, especially some of the individual differences like empathy, might be relevant in these types of scenarios, they are only useful when it comes to detecting genuine behavior. So when somebody's trying to communicate information to you. So my argument is that authenticity discrimination is a skill that we are currently lacking, or at least it's not very good, meaning that being perceptive of emotional cues might actually hinder deception detection. That's my counterclaim to what many have proposed in the past. And I think, as many have mentioned in the past, that if we want to investigate things, we need to rely on strong theoretical mechanisms for what is actually going on. So I've, in most of my research, this is kind of the model that I have in the back of my mind to try to articulate what I think is happening when people make veracity judgments. So if we start with a concept of emotion recognition, so your ability to read nonverbal behavior has an impact on the judgment that people make. I also consider that this was going to be moderated by if people are either lying or telling the truth, and that individual differences in empathy might be important because empathy relates to your ability to integrate what you detect with your knowledge about what those cues might actually mean. The first set of studies that I conducted was simply in an asocial environment, trying to determine if people could detect genuine versus deceptive cues. But instead of using the traditional static photos that I pre-select based on facial muscle activation, like the Duchenne ones, I generated my own naturalistic dynamic videos trying to see if people can detect if an emotional expression is genuine or not. The way I did this is by using a Jack-in-the-Box. So I basically presented people with a Jack-in-the-Box. Some people were responding naturally, while other people had instructions on what they should do instead. So let's see if you could detect which one is the real one. So one of these conditions is a genuine response to the Jack-in-the-Box. Two of them are not. So just to give you insight, this is the genuine one. So the one on the left is the actual response that people have to the Jack-in-the-Box. The other ones are based on some of my instructions. When I look at the data, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, when I look at the data, I find that people, when they see the control condition, they're about 60% accurate, but in specific conditions of deceptive emotions, their accuracy plummets. And it's because they tend to interpret these as being genuine reflections of a surprise reaction. So this, and at least 5 other studies that I've looked at so far, find that people's ability to discriminate genuine from faked emotional reactions is pretty poor. So on average, it's basically sometimes even around like 50% to do so, which means that being a better decoder might not really relate to your ability to detect deception if you can't distinguish genuine cues from deceptive cues. So the next step in this was, now I move it into a deceptive setting to see what people are actually doing when I give them instructions on focusing on facial expressions, monitoring their ability to recognize emotions. Are people that are better able to recognize expressions really better at detecting deception? And just to briefly go over this, so I have different conditions where I train them, or I give them bogus training, and I give them different types of stimuli to see especially effective videos, so not just naturalistic ones. I find that exactly what I predict, and counter to the emotion-based approach, accuracy tends to go down when people are better, are more empathic and better able to recognize emotional cues, because in my opinion, they're being deceived by this type of information. And receiving training doesn't seem to help them in any particular way. So receiving any sort of training, so especially the ones that have been marketed to help with these types of scenarios, doesn't. So in either situation, accuracy is basically flat across the different types of conditions. And the only differences you find are based on the type of lies that people are seeing, not their ability to incorporate this type of training. So I'll skip this interpretation part and go to my main claim for this, and then I'll end on this particular note, is that deception detection, so the terminology that we've been using, assumes the existence of correct answers, which decoders are basically tasked with trying to detect the relevant information and then making accurate inferences. So from the decision-making literature, these are called intellective tasks, like arithmetic, 2 + 2 = 4. I think we should be referring to these things as veracity judgments, which we should be concerned with how judges form decisions when accurate inferences might be impossible to obtain. So these are called judgmental tasks. So I don't think there's anything for people to detect. I only think there's things for people to judge. Maybe machines can do something else, but humans clearly cannot. And the last one is that I do think we have to move over towards using much more advanced techniques to study this, because there is a lot of variability within the deception field in terms of the videos that we use and the decoders. And I don't think the approaches that we've been using so far can accurately capture this type of variability. And that's it. If you want to know more about this research, I have a bunch of papers that look at this role of emotions and veracity judgments And I open the floor to questions.